Previously, I've introduced you to a chemist named Kistiakowsky and a mathematician named von Neumann. Today I'm going to introduce you to a shoe salesman named Strauss, Louis Strauss. As a young man, Louis aspired to be a physicist. But when the time came for him to go to college and study physics, his family's shoe business fell on hard times. So instead of going to college, Louis Strauss hit the road as a shoe salesman. He did this for 3 years, and he was quite successful at it. Later on, he went on to work on Wall Street, where he was also successful and made a bunch of money. He used this money to gain political access, and during the Second World War, he used his political access to get himself a commission in the U.S. Navy. He never went to sea because he was blind in one eye, but he spent the war behind a desk procuring equipment for the Navy. After the war was over, he was one of a number of people who recommended to the Navy that they should do a nuclear test over naval ships in order to determine how destructive a nuclear weapon would be to the ships and how well the ships would resist nuclear attack. This was called Operation Crossroads, and it took place in the Bikini Atoll of the Marshall Islands in Micronesia in the western Pacific Ocean just north of the equator. Atolls are fairly common in the Earth's oceans. There are over 400 of them. The Marshall Islands, which were originally claimed by Spain and then purchased from Spain by Germany, and then taken from Germany by Japan during World War I. Remember, in World War I, Japan and Germany were on opposite sides, and eventually taken from Japan by the United States. They remain associated with the United States. Within the Marshall Islands, there are 34 atolls. The ones of most interest to us are Bikini Atoll, Eniwetok Atoll, and Kwajalein Atoll. The Crossroads test was scheduled to take place in the Bikini Atoll. The theory of atoll formation, the theory of all coral island formation, was first put forward by a young geologist named Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin took part in an exploratory cruise on the HMS Beagle, a small ship of the British Navy, and he observed a number of atolls and other islands in the Pacific. And he came up with the currently accepted theory of atoll formation, which goes like this. When a volcano arises out of the ocean floor and breaks through the surface of the ocean, it is initially sterile. It's hot, nothing can live on it. But as it cools, the larvae of corals attach themselves to the shores of the island, and the corals grow there, forming a fringing reef. Now, these volcanic islands are made of rather weak stone, and over time they subside back into the ocean. As this process begins, the initial fringing reef grows toward the surface of the water. Corals have algae within their tissues, and they need access to sunlight to flourish. So the coral grows up toward the surface of the water as the island is receding, and this leads to an intermediate stage called a barrier reef, where the reef is some distance from what remains of the island. And eventually, as the island subsides completely under the surface of the ocean, all that's left is the ring of coral previously surrounding the island. And that ring of coral and its enclosed body of water called a lagoon is an atoll. The reason that an atoll was attractive to the Navy for the Crossroads test is because the water inside the lagoon is relatively shallow. Outside of the atoll, the water can be 5,000, 25,000 feet deep, but inside it's only a few hundred feet deep. In the case of the Bikini Atoll, it's about 180 feet deep. So it's pretty easy to anchor ships within the atoll. The atoll is big enough to get a lot of ships in there. The Bikini Atoll is about 20 miles across. At the end of World War II, the U.S. Navy was in possession of a lot of captured ships from the Japanese, from the Germans, from the Italians. And they towed about 100 of these ships into the Bikini Lagoon in order to anchor them there at specified intervals so that they could detonate atomic bombs in their midst and see how many ships were affected by the bombs. The first test at Bikini was called Crossroads Able. It was an airburst dropped from a B-29 that took off from Kwajalein Atoll and dropped the bomb supposedly in the center of Bikini Atoll. But in fact, they missed their target by about 1,000 yards. This is a picture of the airburst. You can see that it looks pretty ordinary for an atomic test. It sank about 5 ships, the ones closest to it, and damaged a bunch of others with its shockwave. But there was no great amount of radioactivity. It was detonated high enough in the air that the fireball didn't touch the water. This was pretty favorable for the Navy, and the Navy was happy that they had a lot of news people observing this supposedly secret test. However, the second test was the opposite. This test was detonated below the surface of the water. The water was 180 feet deep. The bomb was half that, 90 feet, suspended from the bottom of a landing craft in the middle of the Bikini Lagoon. As you can see from this picture, this created a whopper of an explosion. Not just the usual mushroom cloud, but a huge column of water coming up underneath the cloud. And then this picture shows a base surge, a huge wave, much bigger than the ships, heading out over the ships and showering them with radioactive seawater. Now, why was the water radioactive? Water and nuclear energy had been associated. There are a lot of water-cooled nuclear reactors. Pure water is not much affected by neutrons. You don't get any radioactive hydrogen isotope, and you do get a radioactive oxygen isotope, but it has a half-life of only about 7 seconds, so it doesn't take long before the water is back to its normal condition, not radioactive. However, seawater is different. Seawater is 3.5% sodium chloride, and both sodium and chlorine are sensitive to neutrons. They will take on neutrons and become radioactive isotopes of sodium and chlorine. So in the case of Crossroads Baker, this radioactive sodium especially was showered over all the ships in the lagoon. So although the blast only sank about another 5 or 10 ships out of the 100 that were anchored there, all of the others were dangerously radioactive. Some of them had animals on them. There were pigs and goats and rats and mice. All the pigs died. Some of the goats. Goats are pretty tough. Most of the rats and mice survived. The Navy had planned to recycle the ships that were used in this test. They were going to tow them to salvage yards where they'd be cut up and sold as scrap metal. But it turned out that the ships were so radioactive that no scrap dealer would touch them. So most of these ships, all but about 5, were sunk in place and are still lying there at the bottom of the lagoon. The press coverage of the secret test was quite sensational, not just in this country but around the world. And the name of the Bikini Atoll was considered to be so hot, so sexy, that a French designer gave the name bikini to his newly designed swimwear. Here's a picture of an original 1947 bikini. Among the participants was a young naval officer named Commander Roger Revelle. Those of you who have studied the history of the global warming situation know that Roger Revelle was one of the authors of the first paper on global warming back in the 1950s. By the way, his co-author was a German scientist who had been involved in nuclear research in Germany during the Second World War, Hans Suess. You'd think that if the Navy learned one thing from the Crossroads test, it would be the extreme vulnerability of surface ships to nuclear weapons. And yet this picture, taken in November of 2017, shows 3 aircraft carriers, 3 Nimitz-class aircraft carriers, steaming close enough together that a single atomic bomb could sink all 3 of them and kill all the people aboard. Each of these carriers has 6,000 crew on board, plus a task force attending it. What has happened to the intelligent people who used to run the U.S. Navy?